Mars exploration project has changed space exploration totally. The team at NASA created the rocket technology to travel 330 million miles in outer space over 8 months and then land on Mars, a planet with little or no gravity and basically no atmosphere. And then do a series of scientific experiments never before done. Please welcome to our stage Robert Bobby Braun, Director of Planetary Science at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. He is in charge of the NASA Mars Exploration Project. Bobby, welcome.
Wow. Well, good morning, everyone. It's great to be here with you. I'm thrilled to represent the Jet Propulsion Laboratory and NASA and talk to you a little bit about exploration of Mars, what we're doing now and what we'll be doing in the future. And I want to start a little bit with my own story. I was very fortunate growing up in the state of Maryland. And in 1976, many of you may remember, the United States landed our first spacecraft on another planet. We landed on Mars. We hoped to do so on July 4th, but we landed on July 20th, 1976. And that was a mission designed to search for life on the red planet. It was a Hail Mary in the sense that we hadn't explored the surface of Mars previously. And the Viking mission, while it looked for life on Mars, it found nothing. And we kind of turned away from Mars for a little while. Now, as a young child, my neighbor brought me into work with him at the Goddard Space Flight Center that day. And I remember sitting there near the control room, watching these engineers and scientists during the landing, jumping up and down and hooting and hollering and, high-fiving like only scientists can, and thinking, boy, one day I'd like to do that. And sure enough, I went off to college and I studied engineering. I got hired by NASA, and I started working on projects to send other spacecraft to Mars. And as it turned out, I was part of a team, people around the country, who sent the very next lander to Mars. And it was called the Mars Pathfinder mission that took the Sojourner rover to the surface of Mars. And that's shown on the bottom of this slide here. The Sojourner rover was about this big, the size of a little baby. It was our first rover on another planet. And it set us on a course of scientific exploration of Mars that we've been pursuing for the last 20 years. In fact, the U.S. has had a continuous presence robotically at Mars ever since. And we've learned all kinds of things in the last several decades with orbiter missions, with lander missions. In fact, the U.S. has attempted to land on Mars since that Mars Pathfinder success 8 times. And my generation has been a part of all of those landings, 7 of 8, which were successful. And through our orbital and landed missions, we've learned a lot about the planet's climate, its geology, its biological past. We've found evidence of past water. We've found habitable zones on Mars where life may have existed in the past. And we're now set to take all of that scientific exploration and all of that engineering know-how and embark on a new chapter in Mars exploration. And that's what I want to talk to you about today. But before I do, I just want to point out the growth in our capabilities over these last couple decades. So in this image, you see the Sojourner rover in the foreground, and the Spirit and Opportunity rovers, which came next, are the roughly golf cart-sized rover to the left of that image. And then we have Curiosity and Perseverance, which are the big rover, to the right of that image. And so as we've tried to understand more and more about Mars, we've had to develop a more significant engineering capability. And in fact, on the Perseverance rover today, on the surface of Mars, we have this emblem that we emplaced on its arm, which shows the evolution of our capability in rovers, from Sojourner through Spirit and Opportunity to Curiosity and Perseverance. And what we're about to embark upon, which is the subject of this talk, is the Mars Sample Return campaign. And in fact, in many ways, Mars Sample Return has already begun. It's begun with the Perseverance mission, which is trundling across the Mars surface today. Perseverance is a rover designed to collect just the right samples, scientifically selected samples, and gather them up for later missions that will gather those samples and bring them all the way back to Earth. Mars Sample Return will be our first round-trip mission to Mars. And so it's a really exciting time in Mars exploration because we have the Perseverance rover on the surface, which will be collecting these samples over the next 5 or 6 years. And at the same time, here on the Earth, we're building the Sample Retrieval Lander and the Earth Return Orbiter that I'll talk to you about in just a moment, and the other facilities needed to gather those samples and study them scientifically in the research labs across the entire world when they're returned to Earth. But let me start with Perseverance, number 1 in this roadmap from left to right. It's a great mission itself, and I have a video just to bring back to you maybe where you were and where the world was on February 18th, 2021, when we landed the Perseverance rover on Mars.
Propulsion, go. EDL phase lead, go.
We have deemed Perseverance ready to execute entry, descent, and landing on her own.
Confirmation of entry interface. Perseverance is currently going 5.3 kilometers per second, about 120 kilometers from the surface of Mars. It will start controlling its path to the landing target. Parachute has deployed and we are seeing significant deceleration. The heat shield has been separated. Perseverance now has radar lock on the ground. The backshell has separated. Skycam maneuver has started, about 20 meters off the surface.
Tango Delta, nominal.
Touchdown confirmed. Perseverance safely on the surface of Mars, ready to begin seeking the sands of past life.
So that was a great day. Boy. You know, it's funny, it was over a year ago, and I still tear up every time I watch that video because it was my team, right? It was thousands of people around the world, around the country, who worked for 8 years to make that moment happen. And if the rocket science of that moment's not hard enough, you know, the last year was in the peak of the global pandemic. Before the vaccines, right? When there was so much uncertainty, when, you know, February 18th, 2021 was maybe the peak of the darkness, if you will, in our world. And one of the things that that moment reminds me of is not just the scientific pursuits and the scientific exploration, but just how we were able to shine a light for the world. When the world needed a little bit of hope, NASA was there. And we all celebrated, not just those of us on the mission, but the world celebrated with us. We were the front page of all the newspapers. Cities all across the globe lit themselves up in red in celebration. President Biden called moments after the landing to congratulate our team. He watched it live, just like the rest of the world. One of the greatest things about NASA is we broadcast everything live, success or failure. You're seeing it at the same time that we are. And it was just a remarkable day. Now, I want to talk to you a little bit more about that day. And in particular, I want to tell you that we landed in a place called Jezero Crater, which is scientifically a treasure trove. But it's super dangerous. It's a really hard place to land. In fact, on this image here, it's a map from above and then a close-up on the right of where we landed. And the red areas are areas that we call death. Areas where we did not want to land the rover. And this is a place where we never would have sent a rover before, but we had perfected a technology called terrain relative navigation, which is a technique to actually, as you're descending towards the surface, the rover took images of the surface and it mapped those images to the map that it had on board. And much like the GPS in your car, but without GPS on Mars, the rover then flew to those images to a safe spot, a safe zone in the middle of the red. And where we actually landed is the white dot in the right-hand image. And you can see that we landed in a super safe place, surrounded by less safe places, surrounded by death, even for the rover. And death, by the way, for a landing site usually means interesting stuff scientifically. And so that's why we chose to go to this site, Jezero Crater, was for the science. And Jezero Crater is a phenomenal place. It was selected by scientists across the world after studying all the places that we might want to land this particular rover. And the reason that we went there is that 3.5 to 4 billion years ago, it's thought to look like the inset of the image, in the lower left here. We know that water flowed across this surface, and 3.5 to 4 billion years ago is when Mars was much warmer and wetter than it is today, much like the Earth in that time. And that's the time frame when life began to evolve here on the Earth. And so that's one of the reasons that we're searching here on Jezero. And what we're doing as we search across the surface is we're gathering samples. This is the first time we've ever had a robotic capability to go up to rocks, just like geologists here on Earth do in the field themselves, and sample those rocks. We can extract little cores, little chalk-sized cores, and place them in sealed containers that are each the size of roughly a test tube, and then preserve those for the later missions that will bring them back to the Earth. And so largely, that's what Perseverance is doing. And in September, approximately 6 months ago, we collected our first rock core at this rock named Rocher. And we actually sampled it twice. That's why you see 2 holes in the rock. And we placed those samples are acquired by a coring drill that places them in a tube. And you can see the tubes in the upper left, in the upper pictures here, in the middle and the left. We image those rock cores to make sure the rock's in there and that we know what it looks like and its size. And then we seal it, as shown in the bottom right of this slide. And Perseverance has now sealed 6 rock cores. We've also gathered an atmospheric sample, and we've sealed a bit of witness material that we brought from the Earth with us. So today, 1 year into our surface mission, we've got 8 sealed tubes out of a total of 43. So we've got about 20% of the tubes that we're carrying in this rover with us sealed and ready to come home, ready for the rest of the Mars sample return campaign. Now, Perseverance is going to continue across the surface probably for the next at least 5 years, and it's going to go to a whole bunch of exciting vistas in this region. It's not just going to sample from the floor of the crater where we are now, but it's going to sample from the walls of the rim around us. It's going to climb up and explore outside of Jezero Crater, get some samples there. And what we expect to get is somewhere between 20 to 40 samples from the entire region. And each of these samples is scientifically selected to be precisely what the scientists would like to study when the samples come back to the Earth. So it's a remarkable mission, and I got to tell you, it's going amazingly well. I couldn't be prouder of the Perseverance team and what they've accomplished. Now, also what's happening here on the Earth is while Perseverance, this is showing the overlay of 3 different missions. So the Perseverance mission is the Mars 2020 mission on the left of this slide. And we're currently in partnership with the European Space Agency building 2 new missions, an orbital mission and a lander mission that together will go get those samples that Perseverance is creating and bring them back to the Earth so that we can study them here on the Earth for all time, much like the Apollo samples that the astronauts gathered on the moon that are still in curation at the Johnson Space Center and which we're still gathering scientific insights from. So the way Mars sample return is going to work is we're going to send 2 additional missions, and I'm showing the major flight elements for those missions here. We have the sample return lander on the left and the sample fetch rover that will be carried by that lander to the surface. the Fetch rover will get samples that Perseverance leaves on the Mars surface and bring them back to this lander. And then we're going to bring along with us the first rocket to Mars. We're actually going to load those samples in a container that's sealed in the nose of that rocket, and then we're going to have our first interplanetary launch in the latter part of this decade, where we send the samples up into Mars orbit. Once they're in Mars orbit, they're going to get picked up by that orbiter that's in the upper right of this image and placed inside an Earth entry vehicle. And then that orbiter has enough fuel not just to go to Mars, but to go to Mars and come back. And it'll position that Earth entry vehicle just right so that that Earth entry vehicle flies through our own atmosphere and lands in the continental US. And I have a video that kind of walks you through that. I'll talk you through this one as well. So this is Mars sample return. This is the decade that we're in right now. This is the chapter of Mars exploration that's happening today. And as I said, it begins with the Perseverance rover, which I've already talked to you about and has already been safely landed on Mars, is currently driving across the Jezero crater, pursuing just the right samples. It's going to use its sample caching system, and it is using that sample caching system to gather those samples, seal them up inside individual tubes, and then store those tubes inside the rover itself. As it proceeds, it'll gather a certain number of tubes that will then place on the Mars surface, and then it'll continue its exploration, gathering more sample tubes. We place the ones on the surface for the sample Fetch rover to retrieve, and then Perseverance also has the capability of bringing the samples to the lander. The Earth orbiter will be launched to Mars first. It'll go into orbit to support the lander, which is launched second. This is the sample return lander launch, headed towards Mars. It'll do an entry, descent, and landing sequence much like Perseverance's, using much of the same technology. But in this case, it'll have one additional feature that I'll talk about in a moment, and it's going to land very close to Perseverance. In fact, Perseverance will be able to film that landing. Here's the sample retrieval lander on the surface. The sample Fetch rover comes off, and it picks up the sample tubes off of the surface that Perseverance has laid there ahead of time. It collects those samples in a tray and brings those samples back to the sample retrieval lander, places them in the nose cone of the Mars ascent vehicle. Perseverance also will return to the sample retrieval lander, bring samples that are stored on board with it back to the sample retrieval lander, place those in that same nose cone, and then when ready, the Mars ascent vehicle, after Perseverance delivers those samples, the Mars ascent vehicle will be prepped and launched into orbit about Mars. Upon achieving orbit, that nose cone that's sealed will release the sealed container of samples into orbit, which will be picked up in an autonomous rendezvous by our orbiter, the Earth Return Orbiter. Once in the Earth Return Orbiter, that container is sealed yet again and placed inside the Earth Entry Vehicle. The Earth Entry Vehicle is in the top of this image. You can see it being manipulated robotically, placed in the Earth Entry Vehicle. The Earth Entry Vehicle is then sealed multiple times. And that bottom half is left at Mars because we don't need it anymore. It's discarded. And then the Earth Return Orbiter then returns to the Earth propulsively, where the Earth Entry Vehicle is oriented for its flight through Earth's atmosphere, spun up and released after the 9-month cruise back to the Earth. Here's the release of the Earth Entry Vehicle. And its landing. It's a fascinating sequence of events. You can see why we would do this, NASA and the European Space Agency together, because these 3 missions are incredibly complex, and it's something that we want to do as a world, frankly, on behalf of the scientific community. The Earth entry vehicle is then recovered in this range out in Utah and brought to a curation facility where the science actually begins. And those scientific samples will be allocated to investigators all around the world. Now, the one technology piece that I wanted to mention that's fascinating to me is builds off of that terrain relative navigation that I mentioned before, the technology that allowed us to go to Jezero Crater. Well, this time we're going to use terrain relative navigation, but we're going to include enough propellant to propulsively maneuver to exactly where we want to go, because those samples are already on the Mars surface. This will be the first time that we're landing to pick up a known quantity in a known location, right? And so like a delivery truck, we want to land right there. And we have the technology actually to land within 20 meters of those samples that are pre-placed on the Mars surface. And so all of these systems, all of these engineering systems, they actually come together on the surface of Mars. The sample retrieval lander on the right-hand side here with the Mars Ascent Vehicle and its stowed configuration, the sample fetch rover and Perseverance will all meet up on the surface of Mars and launch those samples up to see the Earth return orbiter. Now, I mentioned this is our first, not only is this a scientifically compelling and exciting mission, one that scientists around the world have been hoping to do for multiple decades, in which we now have the technology and the capability to do, but it's also our first round-trip mission to Mars. And it's going to pave the way, frankly, for human exploration. Because I, for one, don't want to go to Mars unless there's a way home as well. And while we're talking about rock samples and bringing back a container that's roughly the size of a volleyball, much smaller than humans, obviously this is a pathfinder for the very large systems that we would need to send humans to Mars or to return them safely. And so while for the past 25 years we've gone from rovers this big to car-sized rovers, when we talk about human exploration, Matt Damon in The Martian, for example, what we're really talking about doing is landing two-story houses right next to other two-story houses that have been pre-positioned in which fuel and oxygen and food have been generated before the humans get there autonomously. Think about Antarctica, right? That's probably your best example of what an early Mars base might look like. It's a place where we go scientifically often today here on the Earth, and it's a base camp that's been set up over time. And that's the kind of system that would be needed in place to send humans to Mars. In fact, not only in The Martian did you see elements of a base camp, but if you saw in other science fiction stories, this is from the Mars series that was put out by National Geographic. Take a look at all the systems that are needed to keep humans safe on the Mars surface. There's power generation, there's propellant for maneuvering, there's life support environments, there's food production, there's the idea of living on the surface, but also maybe subsurface dwelling and, for radiation protection. There's transportation to and from Mars. It's a pretty complicated endeavor. And while it's far off, in my view, everything that we're doing on Mars today in our robotic exploration, everything that my generation has been doing to get ready for this is really a handover to the next generation of scientists and engineers. And so in summary, what I've hoped to tell you today is a few things. First of all, Mars is a remarkably diverse world. Every time we go to Mars, we're surprised, not just by what we learn, but by new questions that we end up asking ourselves based on what we've seen. And while we've been exploring Mars for 25 years, we're now just beginning the next chapter of that saga with the Mars Sample Return Campaign. And this will be the most complex and most significant robotic exploration undertaking of our lifetime. And the only way we're going to be successful is to actually build it off of everything that we've accomplished so far. And that mission itself, while scientifically exciting, will really just be a pathfinder, a very small pathfinder, for what's required to eventually send humans to Mars. And to do so, we have to continue to advance our capabilities so that we, as humans, can explore Mars and elsewhere in deep space. Thank you very much. I appreciate your time and attention.
If I might, I'd like to ask Bobby a couple of questions. I mean, this sounds like the most complex DoorDash mission ever.
Yeah.
I mean, you got to go pick up the stuff and deliver it home
awesome.
safely. But
an engineer's dream.
Engineer's dream. When the Mars lander is descending, you deploy a parachute. Mm-hmm. How does the parachute work in a place where the atmosphere is not as dense as the Earth's atmosphere? In other words, you have resistance of air slowing it down.
Yeah, it's a great question. So we use a supersonic parachute at Mars, meaning it deploys at high speeds, right? And the atmosphere of Mars is at ground level is roughly equivalent to Earth's atmosphere at about 100,000 feet. And so we actually test our parachute on Earth at those altitudes. So we either with a balloon or a rocket or both, we launch our atmosphere towards space, launch our parachute towards space, and we deploy it at 100,000 feet on the Earth to make sure it works. Before we do that, we test it in ground-based wind tunnels, and then we make sure it's going to work on Mars by testing the way we're going to fly here on the Earth.
We were talking the other night, and I asked you when we've tested the soil of Mars, what's in it? And you said there was something that is dangerous in it.
Yeah.
Or maybe that's not the right adjective.
Well, not dangerous, but, yeah, dangerous.
Yeah.
Dangerous for us.
Dangerous for us.
Yeah, so the soil
I don't care about
Mars,
the Martians. I mean,
yeah, the Martians are fine.
They're fine with it.
Yeah, and our robots are fine with it. The soil of Mars is toxic for Earth-type life. It's got hexavalent chromium in it.
Chromium, that was what it was.
In The Martian, you saw that he had to grow food, right? And he made his own potato farm. That would be pretty hard to do in reality with Martian soil. The other problem you have on Mars is there's dust, and the dust contains a lot of the same elements of the soil. So if humans were there, they would get dusty when they're outside, and then they would come inside, and you'd have to clean all that dust off. And if you go back and look at the footage of the Apollo missions when they were on the moon, the whole inside of the Apollo capsule got covered in lunar dust. And so it's a very big challenge for human exploration, not so much for robotics.
And then you mentioned, even though the temperature on Mars is whatever it is, and you can tell us what it is.
Frigid.
It's cold. You said you could get a real bad sunburn there because?
Well, so here on the Earth, we have the Van Allen belts that protect us from the most harmful radiation that's headed our way. Mars does not have that. Mars does not have the Van Allen belts, and they don't have a global magnetic field Mars to shield life on Mars from that same environment that's in space.
Would I get a worse sunburn than in Naples?
Well, it depends how long you're outside, I guess.
Yeah. All right.
You can stay inside at either place,
if I stay inside,
and you'd be fine.
good.
You'd be fine.
Bobby, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Thank you, Tyler.